The question was logged at 0347 station time during a routine officer assessment intake, and the recording almost wasn't kept. Standard procedure for Joint Command assessments was a 48-hour retention window on intake audio before automatic deletion, enough time to flag anything requiring follow-up, short enough that the archives didn't fill with the administrative noise of routine processing. The intake officer who reviewed the log at hour 46 almost let it cycle out. He had reviewed 11 other intakes that week. None of them had produced anything worth keeping. He listened to the exchange once. Then he flagged it, pulled it from the deletion queue, and sent it up 3 levels of command with a subject line that simply read, "You need to hear this." The exchange was 47 seconds long. It began with Commander Vethkareth, the Dora T Alliance's senior Joint Command assessor, asking a question he had asked 412 times across a 19-year career evaluating officers from 37 species for interspecies command qualification. The question was standard. Calibration data. Baseline metric. State your confirmed kill count for the record. The human Marine on the other side of the table was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she said, "Which war?" Commander Vethkareth had been doing this for 19 years, and the reason he was good at it, the reason the Alliance kept assigning him to joint assessments despite his personal preference for field command, was that he paid attention to the wrong things. Most assessors paid attention to the answers. He paid attention to the 3 seconds before the answers. The specific quality of silence that preceded a response told him more than the response itself, whether the officer was calculating or retrieving or constructing or genuinely confused. 412 assessments had given him a taxonomy of pre-answer silences that he trusted more than any standardized scoring rubric. The human's 3 seconds were none of his categories. She was not calculating. Her eyes had not moved in the way of someone running internal numbers. She was not retrieving. There was no upward gaze, no the specific slight tension of memory access. She was not constructing a strategic answer. He had learned to read the micro-expressions of that particular deception across 37 species, and her face showed none of them. She was asking a genuine question. Which war? Not which engagement. Not which operation. War. Plural. Implied. Multiple wars, and the question of which one he wanted was a question she considered genuinely necessary before she could answer. He looked at her file. He had reviewed it before the assessment, as he reviewed all files, in the 45 minutes of preparation that was his standard practice. He had noted Marine First Sergeant Jana Kovac. Age 34. Service duration 14 years. Commendations, 14 individual, 3 unit. Postings, 7, across 6 different operational theaters. 6 different operational theaters in 14 years. He had assessed officers from species with 300-year lifespans who had fewer theater postings. Clarify, he said. I've been in 3 separate declared conflicts, she said. For if you count the Kepler Corridor interdiction, which was technically classified as a peacekeeping operation but had a higher casualty rate than the second Veth border engagement, so I've always found that classification interesting. She looked at him steadily. The numbers are different for each. Do you want the aggregate, or do you want them broken out? He looked at her for a moment. Broken out, he said. She gave him 4 numbers. The aggregate was a figure that, in the Dora T assessment framework, placed an officer in the top 3% of confirmed kill metrics for any species in Joint Command qualification history. He wrote it down. He did not show his reaction, because showing reactions during assessment intake was not professional, and Vethkareth was relentlessly professional. But he thought, *6 theaters. 4 wars. 14 years. 34 years old, *. And then he thought something he had not thought about a human officer before, and would spend the next several weeks trying to stop thinking about, because it implied something about the species that he found profoundly uncomfortable. He thought, she's young. The Joint Command qualification process existed because the Galactic Compact had determined, after several expensive lessons, that interspecies military cooperation produced better outcomes when the officers coordinating it had been assessed against common standards and had each other's professional frameworks validated by an independent body. In theory, this was straightforward. In practice, the assessment revealed, repeatedly and without mercy, every place where different species had developed fundamentally incompatible assumptions about what military competence looked like. Vethkareth had learned to expect this. He had learned to adjust his frameworks, to translate across cultural contexts, to recognize when a low score on a Doherty metric indicated a genuine capability gap versus a different approach to the same problem. He was good at this. It was why he was here. He was not prepared for Jana Kovac to make him question the metrics themselves. The kill count question was the first indicator. The second came 40 minutes into the assessment, during the strategic scenario portion. He presented the standard Doherty scenario: a defensive position, limited resources, an advancing force of superior numbers, a defined timeline before reinforcement. He had run this scenario 412 times. The expected outputs varied by species. Doherty officers maximized defensive fortification, Velhari officers prioritized information gathering, Ethani officers typically began with resource conservation calculations, but the outputs followed recognizable patterns. Recognizable logic. Jana Kovac looked at the scenario for 90 seconds. Then she said, "Who's in the advancing force?" He paused. Unknown hostile combatants. Unknown in terms of not identified, or unknown in terms of not yet determined whether they're hostile? He stared at her. For the purposes of the scenario, they are identified as hostile. "Okay," she said. "But the scenario says the position was established 72 hours ago, and the advancing force has been moving toward it for 48 hours. If they'd wanted to engage in the first 48 hours, they could have. Their approach vector suggests they knew the position was there. So what have they been doing for 48 hours? The scenario does not. Because if they've been approaching for 48 hours at that pace with knowledge of our position, the most resource-efficient move for a superior force would have been to engage before we consolidated the defensive advantage." She tapped the scenario display, which means either they don't know about the resource constraints, or they're not actually trying to reach us in the timeline given, or there's something about this position they want intact. She looked at him. "I'm not trying to be difficult," she said. "I just need to know whether this is a combat problem or a communication problem before I spend resources solving the wrong one." Vethkareth looked at the scenario he had designed 19 years ago, run 412 times, and had never once been asked to clarify in this particular direction. He made a note. "Assume combat," he said. "All right," she said. And she solved it. Competently, efficiently, with a solution that scored in the upper 20% of his historical range, not the highest he had seen, but solid, and with a reasoning chain that he found more interesting than the solution itself. After, he said, "Why did you ask whether it was a communication problem?" She looked at him with the specific quality of someone deciding whether the question was genuine or a test. "Because in my experience," she said, "the most expensive engagements are the ones that didn't need to happen. You solve those differently than the ones that do." "How often," he said carefully, "does that distinction matter in practice?" She looked at the ceiling briefly. A human expression he had learned to read as genuine calculation. "Third war," she said. "The Kepler corridor interdiction. 13 months in, the force we'd been engaging for nearly a year turned out to be a factional militia acting without authorization from their government, and their government had been trying to reach us through channels we'd blocked as part of the communications interdiction strategy." She paused. "So we'd been fighting someone who wanted to stop fighting for about 6 months without knowing it." He said nothing. "The kill count for that period is in the numbers I gave you," she said. "I've thought about that a lot." The assessment room was very quiet. He made another note. He did not show his reaction. But he was beginning to understand that the exchange that would later be flagged and sent up 3 levels of command was not 47 seconds of intake audio. It was the beginning of a very long question that the Doherty Alliance had not known it needed to ask. The assessment took 2 days. Standard qualification assessments ran 6 to 8 hours. The 2-day extension required Vethkareth to file an administrative exception with justification, and the justification he filed was technically accurate but deliberately incomplete. Extended scenario complexity, additional clarification required. What it did not say was, I keep asking follow-up questions and her answers keep leading somewhere I didn't expect, and I need more time to understand what I'm actually assessing. On the second day, in the afternoon session, he made the mistake that he would later, in his official report, describe as a methodological recalibration and that he described to himself, in the privacy of his own assessment, as a failure of professional detachment. He asked her about the First War. Not as an assessment question. The scenario portion was complete, the tactical evaluations were complete, the command structure simulations were complete. He asked as someone who had spent 2 days watching a person answer questions and had arrived at a question that the rubric didn't contain. The first declared conflict in your record, he said. You were 19. 20, she said. I enlisted at 18, training took a year and a half, first deployment was at 20. You've been in continuous or near continuous active deployment since then. With gaps, she said. About 18 months total, cumulative. In 14 years. Yes. He looked at her. Why? She looked back. Why what? Why continue? He said. The Doherty assessment framework includes a psychological sustainability metric, the degree to which an officer's service motivation remains stable across extended deployment. Most species show degradation in that metric after the third or fourth major deployment. Motivation shifts from ideological or relational to institutional. They continue because leaving would require a new identity, not because the original reason remains active. That's a real thing, she said. I've seen it. Your psychological metric is anomalous, he said. It has not degraded. She was quiet for a moment. You're asking why I'm still here, she said. Yes. She considered this with the genuine seriousness she brought to most questions. My sister, she said finally. He waited. She's 12 years younger than me, Jana said. She was 8 when I enlisted. She lives on a colony that's been in a contested zone for 6 of the last 9 years. She paused. Every deployment I've done, I've been able to say, this is the thing in front of me that, if I do it right, makes her life smaller in a specific way. Makes the contested zone smaller. Makes the probability of something reaching her smaller. She looked at him. That's not a sophisticated calculation. It's a very simple one. And when the connection is indirect? He said. When the engagement is far from her location and the causal chain between your actions and her safety is attenuated? Then I'm helping someone else's sister, she said. That's also sufficient. He wrote something in his notes. She looked at what he was writing, then looked back at him. Is that going to affect my score? She said. No, he said. It's a personal notation. What does it say? He considered whether to tell her. He decided that the assessment had already gone to places that the rubric didn't anticipate and that honesty was appropriate. It says, the motivation does not degrade because it is not ideological. It is specific. It has a name, asterisk. She looked at him. You've assessed 400 assessments, she said. How many people gave you a name? He thought about it. You're the first, he said. The rehook came not from Vethkaratha's assessment but from what he found when he pulled her complete service record, the full version, not the summary that accompanied standard intake files. He had not pulled the full record before the assessment. Standard practice was to review the summary and allow the assessment itself to provide the detail, to avoid the prejudgment that comprehensive file review sometimes produced. He pulled it after day 1. Because something she had said about the Kepler corridor interdiction had produced a discrepancy in his understanding of the timeline that he needed to resolve. He resolved the discrepancy within the first 10 minutes of reviewing the full record. He spent another 3 hours reading. Not because it was required. Because he could not stop. The full record showed something that the summary's clean categories, theaters, commendations, postings, had abstracted into invisibility. The full record showed time. Specifically, it showed the gaps between postings. The 18 months of cumulative non-deployment time she had mentioned. Those gaps were not rest periods. The first gap, 3 months between second and third deployment. Medical leave. The record showed the injury that produced it, a specific category of blast-related trauma with a recovery prognosis of 4 to 6 months. She had returned to active duty in 3. The second gap, 4 months. Medical leave again. Different injury. The record showed the physical therapy protocol prescribed and the point at which she had been cleared for return. She had been cleared at 4 months. The protocol recommended 6. The third gap, 5 months. Not medical leave. Compassionate leave. The record showed a personal loss, the specific designation that the compact used for bereavement, and the standard minimum of 1 month typically associated with it. She had taken 5 months. He stared at that entry for a long time. 5 months of compassionate leave. The longest single gap in her 14-year record. He did not know who she had lost. He knew, from the pattern of every other gap, from the 1.5 months of deployment training, from the medical leaves that ended before their recommended completion, that 5 months was not the duration of her grief. 5 months was the duration of something else. He pulled the re-enlistment documentation filed at the end of the 5th month. It was 3 lines. It gave no reason. It was filed on a Tuesday, standard administrative processing, no flag, no review, no counselor sign-off. Those were optional at re-enlistment, not required. 3 lines. A name, a date, a signature. He sat with it for a long time. Then he went back to the session recording from day 1 and listened to the 47-second exchange again. Which war? He had spent 19 years assessing kill counts. He had thought of kill counts as metrics, data points in a capability assessment. He had never thought about what it meant that a question produced multiple answers. Multiple wars. Multiple numbers. Each number a different category of the same event, accumulated across a life that had not stopped accumulating them. And the fact that she had not given him the aggregate first. The fact that she had asked which one he wanted, because they were different to her, because each conflict had its own meaning and its own cost, and she kept them separate in the way of someone who has learned that conflating them loses something important. He did not know, reading her record on the night between assessment days, what the 5 months had been. He did not know what she had lost that was worth 5 months and not 1 day more. He knew that whatever it was, she had come back. 3 lines. A name, a date, a signature. And then, 7 more years. He closed the record. He thought about the psychological sustainability metric and the notation he had made. Asterisk, the motivation does not degrade because it is not ideological. It is specific. It has a name, asterisk. He opened a new document and wrote a second notation that was not part of any standard assessment rubric. It said, I have been measuring the wrong things. The Joint Command Qualification Board met to review Vethkaratha's assessment recommendation 6 days after the intake. The board was standard composition, 3 Dora T senior commanders, 1 Velhari observer, 1 Ethani observer, and the administrative recorder who kept the formal minutes. They had reviewed 14 qualification recommendations in the preceding quarter. This was the 15th. Vethkarath presented his recommendation, which was qualification approval with a notation of exceptional interoperability profile, the highest supplementary designation in the framework, awarded to fewer than 4% of assessed officers. The board approved it in 12 minutes. It was in the discussion period following approval that things became unusual. Commander Reshvalathi, senior board member, had read the full assessment notes. She had read the notation about the motivation metric. She had read the second notation, the non-rubric one, that Vethkarath had included in the supplementary materials. You wrote that you had been measuring the wrong things, she said. Yes, he said. Explain. He had been thinking about how to explain it for 6 days, and he had not found a formulation he was entirely satisfied with, but he had found one he could present. The qualification framework assesses capability, he said. Physical metrics, tactical metrics, psychological sustainability, command judgment. These are the things we measure because they are the things we have determined predict operational effectiveness. Correct, Reshvalathi said. The framework does not assess what I would call operational continuity, he said. By which I mean, not the capacity to perform in a given engagement, but the capacity to continue performing across engagements, across time, across losses that are sufficient to stop a rational actor. That's what the psychological sustainability metric measures. No, he said. The psychological sustainability metric measures motivation stability. Whether an officer continues to want to do the work. That's different from whether they continue to do it regardless of what they want. The board was quiet. First Sergeant Kovac has taken 3 medical leaves in 14 years, he said. Each ended before the recommended completion of the recovery protocol. She returned to service in a state that the medical records describe, in the neutral language of clinical documentation, as within acceptable parameters for deployment. He paused. She has also experienced a personal loss significant enough to produce a 5-month compassionate leave, the longest single gap in her service record. At the end of those 5 months, she re-enlisted. No counselor review. 3 lines of documentation. Many officers return from compassionate leave, Reshvalathi said. Yes, he said. But I reviewed the Compact's statistics on compassionate leave re-enlistment rates across species. The overall rate is 63%. For officers with 5 or more years of active service at the time of the leave, it is 51%. For officers who have experienced the specific designation in her record, he paused. I won't specify what the designation indicates. It is in the supplementary materials for those who wish to review it. Nobody spoke. The rate for that specific category, he said, is 38%. He looked around the table. She is in the 38%, he said. And she has served for 7 years since that leave, across 3 postings, with performance metrics that have not declined. What are you suggesting the framework is missing? Reshvalathi said. He thought about 47 seconds of intake audio. About which war? About a name and a date and a signature at the end of 5 months. I'm suggesting, he said carefully, that we have built a qualification framework designed to identify officers who are capable, and that the framework does not have a category for officers who continue past the point where capability alone is sufficient reason to continue. Every qualified officer continues past difficult points. Yes, he said, with support systems, recovery time, appropriate medical intervention, institutional structure. The framework is designed with the assumption that these systems function as designed. He looked at his notes. First Sergeant Kovac's record suggests she has continued in periods when those systems were incomplete, when recovery time was insufficient, when the institutional structure did not fully compensate for what she had absorbed. And she continued anyway, Reshvalathi said. She continued anyway, he said. The room was quiet for a moment. Why? Reshvalathi asked. She told me, he said. A name. Her sister. He picked up the assessment file. The framework identifies what officers can do, he said. It does not identify what officers will refuse to stop doing. Those are different things. And in 14 years of assessment, I have not encountered the second category in a form this. He stopped. Chose the word. Persistent. Reshvalathi looked at the other board members. Then she looked back at Vethkareth. You're recommending we revise the framework, she said. I'm recommending we think carefully about what we're measuring, he said. And whether what we're measuring is actually the most important thing. What is the most important thing? He thought about the 5-month gap in the 3 lines and the 7 subsequent years. I don't know yet, he said honestly. But I think it's the thing the 47 seconds of intake audio is pointing at, and I think we should figure out what it is before we build another 400 assessments on a framework that doesn't account for it. Jana Kovac received her Joint Command Qualification notification 6 days after the assessment. Standard procedure. No unusual documentation. The exceptional interoperability profile notation meant she would be considered for the Joint Command pool ahead of standard timeline, but the notification didn't explain why. Didn't mention the board discussion. Didn't mention the extended assessment or the second notation or the administrative flag that had kept 47 seconds of intake audio out of a deletion queue. She read the notification in the transit lounge at Kepler Station, waiting for transport to her new posting. She forwarded it to her sister. Her sister, who was 22 now and living in a colony that had been outside the contested zone for 3 years, sent back a response that was a single image, herself grinning, holding up the notification that she had apparently also been sent, a courtesy copy from the Compact's family notification system, which Jana had set up at enlistment and had never canceled. a small administrative decision that had been quietly renewing itself for 14 years. Jana looked at the image for a moment. Then she put the notification away and looked out the transit lounge window at the docking bay where her transport was being loaded. She thought about the assessment, about the 47 seconds that she hadn't known were being recorded, or flagged, or sent up 3 levels of command. About the question that had seemed obvious to her but had apparently produced a reaction she hadn't anticipated. Which war? She had asked it because the answer was genuinely different depending on the context, and she had learned, in 14 years, that giving someone a number without context was giving them the shape of a thing without the thing itself. The numbers meant something different from each other. She kept them separate for that reason. She had not known that the question itself would become the thing that mattered. She didn't know it now either. She didn't have access to the board discussion or Vethkaratha's notations or the statistical analysis of compassionate leave reenlistment rates. She didn't know that a senior Dora T commander had spent 6 days trying to articulate what he had recognized in 47 seconds of her being entirely honest about a question she'd found genuinely necessary. What she knew was the transit lounge, the docking bay, the new posting, and the image of her sister, grinning, holding up a piece of paper. She put the datapad away and picked up her bag. The posting was Joint Command. New, by design, the Compact's first attempt at a genuinely integrated operational command structure, pulling officers from 9 species into a single command framework rather than the parallel track coordination that had been standard before. It was, by every institutional measure, ambitious to the point of recklessness. It was also, by every practical measure, necessary. The threat environment that had produced it was not going away. Jana arrived on the command station 14 hours after the transit lounge, carrying the same single bag she had carried through 6 theaters and 4 wars and the 5 months and the 3 lines of reenlistment documentation, and she checked in with the Joint Command intake desk, and she was assigned quarters, and she found them and sat down on the bunk and looked at the wall for a moment. The wall was gray. Standard military construction. She had looked at a lot of gray walls. She opened her datapad and looked at the image of her sister again. Then she set the datapad down and lay back on the bunk and stared at the ceiling. The Joint Command assignment would begin in the morning. 9 species, 1 structure, a threat environment that the briefing documents she had read in transit described with the specific measured language of people who were being careful not to cause panic but were having some difficulty with that goal. She thought about which war this would be. She didn't have a number yet. She thought about Vethkarath, who had asked her questions for 2 days and had taken notes in a way that suggested the notes were about something other than the rubric, and who had, at the end of the 2nd day, looked at her with the specific expression of someone who has been doing something for 19 years and has encountered something that the 19 years did not prepare for. She had not asked him what he was thinking. She had thought about it. But some conversations were complete without the follow-up, and that one felt complete. She closed her eyes. She thought about the colony, the contested zone that was not a contested zone anymore. The 22-year-old who was grinning in a transit lounge photograph holding a piece of paper. She thought, this is the thing in front of me. She thought, I will do it. She thought this the way she always thought it. Not with drama. Not with the weight of a decision. Just as a fact, as plain and as stable as the gray wall, as the bunk, as the datapad with the image on it. Then she slept. In the morning she met the other officers. 8 species plus her. 9 total. The command structure was provisional. Everyone came from a different institutional framework, and the process of building something functional out of 9 different definitions of command was going to take time that the operational timeline was not going to fully provide. She knew this. She had been in joint operations before, though not at this level of integration. She knew the specific friction of trying to coordinate with people whose professional instincts had been shaped by completely different experiences of what coordination meant. She had learned, across 4 wars, to ask early. She introduced herself to the Dora T commander across the briefing table before the formal session began. Kovek, she said. Human. Logistics background, transitioned to combat leadership in the 2nd deployment. He looked at her. His name tag said Vethkarath, and something about the name made her pause. Vethkarath, she said. The assessor. My cousin, he said. He mentioned your assessment. She looked at him. What did he mention? Kareth considered. He said you asked a question during intake that he had not been asked in 19 years of assessment. He paused. He said it changed how he was going to approach the next 19. She thought about which war. It was a genuine question, she said. He knows, Kareth said. That's what changed things. The formal session began before she could respond. The command structure details, the operational briefing, the 9 different sets of professional instincts beginning the slow work of finding the places where they could function together. She paid attention. She asked questions when she had them, which was often. She noted the places where her instincts and the room's instincts diverged, because those were the places where she would either cause friction or find unexpected capability, and she had learned to tell the difference. At the end of the session, walking out, Kareth fell into step beside her. What he said, Kareth said, without preamble. About measuring the wrong things. He's been saying it for weeks. He's submitted a proposal for framework revision. What kind of revision? He wants to add a metric, Kareth said. For something he's calling operational continuity. The capacity to continue past the point where capability alone is sufficient reason to continue. She thought about this. That's a hard thing to measure, she said. Yes, he said. He knows. He's been trying to design the measurement. He paused. He said the difficulty is that it requires asking officers about things they don't typically disclose in assessment contexts. Personal things. Things with names. She thought about the 5 months. About 3 lines of documentation. What does the metric look like so far? She said. Incomplete, Kareth said. He asked me to give you something. He handed her a folded document. She unfolded it. It was a draft. Early stage, annotated with revision notes, with questions marked in the margins that hadn't been answered yet. The kind of document that was still figuring out what it was trying to say. At the top, in the header field where completed documents put a title, this one put a question. The question was, what keeps you here? She looked at it for a long time. She thought about a gray wall. The bunk. An image of a grinning 22-year-old. She thought about 4 wars and 4 different numbers and the 5 months that had eventually become 3 lines on a Tuesday. She thought about the things in front of her, always more things in front of her, and the specific quality of a species that had spent 10,000 years looking at things in front of them and deciding, with very little philosophical scaffolding, to address them. Not because the outcome was certain. Not because the cost was manageable. Because they were there and the thing was there and someone had to. She folded the document and put it in her jacket. Tell him, she said to Kareth, that the metric is harder than he thinks. Why? She looked at the corridor ahead of her. The Joint Command Station. 9 species, 1 structure, a threat environment that the briefing documents were being careful about. The things in front of her. Because the people who can answer the question, she said, are usually the ones who never thought of it as a question. She walked ahead. Kareth watched her go, and he understood, in the specific way of someone whose cousin had spent 6 days trying to articulate something and had only partially succeeded, that he was watching the thing his cousin had been trying to describe. Not capability. Something past capability. Something that looked, from the outside, like ordinary motion. Walking down a corridor, showing up in the morning, doing the work in front of you, and that required, from the inside, a commitment so total and so quiet that it produced no drama, no announcement, no flag in any assessment rubric. Just presence. Just continuation. Just the specific, irreducible human decision to still be there, made over and over, every morning, for 14 years and counting, with a name as the reason and a gray wall as the witness. He thought about which war. He thought about how the answer to that question was always the current one, and the one after that, and the one after that, and that somewhere in that pattern, in the refusal to let the number become singular, in the insistence on keeping the wars separate and named and meaningful, in the motion that kept going past the point where going was a choice, was something the Doherty assessment framework had been building for 19 years without knowing what it was building toward. He didn't know what to do with that understanding. He suspected that was also the point. The galaxy had been measuring humanity against the frameworks it had built for itself, and humanity kept producing answers the frameworks hadn't anticipated, and the problem was not with the answers. The problem was that nobody had yet built the framework large enough to hold what humanity was actually showing them. And by the time they did, by the time Vethkaratha's draft became a metric and the metric became a standard and the standard became something that could be evaluated and scored and placed in a rubric, there would be a new question. A question that the new rubric also didn't have a category for. Asked by someone sitting across a table from an assessor who had done this 412 times. Asked in the genuine, necessary, completely matter-of-fact tone of someone for whom the answer was different depending on the context. And the assessor would pause. And the question would hang in the assessment room. And the audio would be flagged. And it would start again. Because that was the thing nobody had found a way to measure yet. Not the kills, not the deployments, not the sustainability metric or the command judgment score or the interoperability profile. The thing that kept producing new questions in rooms designed only for answers. The thing that walked down corridors toward the next problem with a single bag and a name in its pocket and no particular interest in whether the conditions were favorable. The thing that, when asked to explain itself, looked back with the patient, genuine expression of someone who does not understand why the question requires explanation, and says simply, someone had to.